working with lots of different organisations, either non-profit organisations or councils around healthy catering. What we found was when we sat down with people to look at how to order healthy foods, there were a lot of food myths. So people have lots of different beliefs about food, and there were some common ones which kept on coming up. So we wanted to do a myth-busting session that addressed the common food myths. So what we do is we just introduce a little bit about how food myths are everywhere. They're on television and magazines. We talk about them at work. When you're going to work, you hear people talking about food myths. They've been going on for a very long time. We're immersed in them. So we talk a little bit about, well, what are some of the common food myths around at the moment, or what are the common issues around food, and then we give people a little quiz, like a true and false, and then we go through them systematically and address them and give people the correct information. One of the most common food myths we come across is that people will say butter is better than margarine, and if you're looking at it from a health perspective, that's false. Margarine's definitely much better. It's mainly because butter has at least 50% saturated fat, and saturated fat is associated with heart disease. And margarines are made from plants, so they're high in the good oils or the good fats, the polyunsaturated fats. Also in Australia, the Heart Foundation has worked really hard at getting rid of trans fats, which are a particular saturated fat, which is really, really bad. And so our margarines have negligible or no trans fats in them. Another common food myth is to avoid white bread, because people have got the message that wholemeal and whole grain is better for you because of the fibre. However, it doesn't mean that you need to get rid of white bread completely. White bread is still a good source of B vitamins, and it's still a good source of fibre, even though it might only be half the amount that you can get in whole grain and wholemeal. Like, a lot of people do still prefer white bread, so from a catering perspective, we always recommend that people have both white bread, whole grain, wholemeal. So it might be breads, it might be wraps, it might be sandwich thins, it might be rice or noodles, to have the whole variety. Sea salt versus table salt is a common myth at the moment, particularly as they're promoting a lot of different types of sea salts, but there's actually no difference between them at all, other than in how they're produced. In regards to catering, we say to people, don't use any salt if you can, because we only need about a teaspoon of salt a day. We get a lot of sodium naturally from the foods that we eat. 75% of the salt we have is from processed products, so we don't need to put salt in cooking, we don't need to put it on sandwiches, we don't need to put it on the table. And from the surveys, most people now, the majority of people don't use salt in cooking, and they don't use it at the table, so they're not looking for it. People's first reaction to cakes with regards to catering is that you can't have them because they are bad. So cakes can be really high in fat and sugar. However, we can still include them, you just have to make sensible choices. So with catering, what we say is look for cake which is uniced, small amounts, so cutting a slice or a cake up into very small portions, and cake that is fruit-based. Most people would say that healthy foods do cost more, and that's a true food myth. I guess with that, the average council spends between $30,000 and $50,000 a year on food for meetings and functions, and we worked out that typically these foods are mostly things like pies and pasties, deep fried dim sims and spring rolls, cream biscuits, iced cakes and sausages. That's a lot of food that's being offered to people which is not health promoting and is actually detrimental to their health. But you can make very small changes. You can swap those foods for alternatives that people don't even notice, which are much more healthy. So for example, swapping the sausages for a low-fat, low-salt brand, which you can get cheaply in a supermarket. It's much better value because it has more meat in it. You can swap sweet biscuits for choices which don't have as much sugar in it. You can use things like cold rolls and mini quiches and meatballs and things like that. If you make those changes, those small changes, that often people don't even notice, you can decrease that total fat intake by 310 kilos, which is equivalent to the size of 4 average men. And you can bring it down by 3,428 teaspoons of salt, which is equivalent to 20 kilos of salt. And these aren't drastic changes, they're just little changes. So that's a significant difference in terms of people's health. When we discuss the food myths with groups, it's really interesting because everybody eats and everyone has an opinion, and people do hear about these food myths all the time, and so they're very engaged with it. Often they, something that we find is false, that people will actually feel is true. So it takes them a little while to kind of adjust, to listen to the rationale behind it, and just to think, oh yes, maybe my beliefs aren't quite correct. So yeah, lots of people are very surprised.